He said the powder came from a stranger, a man he'd never seen before, cloaked in vague features and vanishing just as quickly as he appeared. A man who, by some absurd miracle, had offered him a harmless substance to improve the bishop's porridge. The cook, John Roos, stood there, trembling, repeating the story as if reciting a prayer he wasn't sure he believed anymore. And that's when history does what it always does. It makes you choose between the foolish and the frightening. And the frightening was Roos merely a fool who accepted a mysterious powder from a stranger? What kind of cook, entrusted with the health of an entire household, would risk adding something unknown to a nobleman's meal? The very idea strains reason, but sometimes what strains reason is not stupidity. It's something darker, something colder. What if Roos wasn't lying, but merely a puppet whose strings were pulled by someone far more dangerous? Or worse, what if he was lying, building this imaginary stranger as a smokescreen, concealing a calculated attempt at murder, one that bore no fingerprints but his own? What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the deaths that followed, but the holes in every version of the truth. No witnesses ever saw this so-called stranger. No one came forward. The powder, whatever it truly was, dissolved completely in the porridge, consumed by victims whose pain spoke louder than any evidence ever could. Their bodies writhed, mouths foamed, and their breath rattled like wind through a ruined chapel. One by one, they fell. Bishop Fisher's guests, his servants, even the bishop himself, all poisoned at the breakfast table, their last meal shared in what should have been safety, routine, life. And through it all, Roos remained in the kitchen, not running, not hiding, but paralyzed, pale, sweating, shaking. Witnesses said he turned ghost white the moment the first cries were heard. Would a killer stay to witness the carnage he created, or does that make him look even guiltier? That question haunted the men tasked with finding the truth, because neither answer was safe. If Roos was guilty, it meant murder had crept into the sacred heart of domestic life, into kitchens where warmth and trust are supposed to live. But if he was innocent, then something far more terrifying was loose in England, a faceless force capable of turning anyone into a killer without their knowledge. Roos may have been the vessel, but whose hand poured the poison? Fisher had enemies, many of them political rivals who hated his alignment with Queen Catherine, religious factions that saw him as a symbol of Catholic defiance during the king's divorce, and shadowy figures who operated in silence, in whispers, behind velvet curtains and locked cathedral doors. Any of them might have wanted him dead, and what better weapon than a humble servant, unassuming, unnoticed, and completely disposable. But England in the 1500s was no place for delicate nuance. Truth was not a treasure, it was a threat. To find it, interrogators turned to the only tool they trusted, pain. Roos was questioned again and again. Under increasing pressure, they used fire, they used iron, they used sleep deprivation and cold floors, and prayers twisted into accusations. Still, he repeated the same story. A prank, he said. A joke. He thought it would make the bishop laugh. A man in a dark cloak told him it was just a flavor enhancer. The idea that anyone could be that foolish made people furious. But there was something in his tears, some ragged sincerity, that gave others pause. He didn't cry like a liar. He cried like a man who'd already been sentenced in his own heart. Guilt and innocence melted together into a slurry no one could separate. As the trial unfolded, the country watched in disgust, in fear, and in morbid fascination. Roos became a symbol, but of what no one could agree. Was he a demon, a dupe, or a doorway to something England had long tried to deny? That power doesn't always wear a crown or swing a sword. Sometimes it creeps in through the back door, offers you a smile, and hands you a little pouch of powder. That's how conspiracies are built, not with declarations, but with small, terrible choices no one notices until someone dies. And in this case, many died. Fisher himself, the bishop with a voice too loud for the changing times, lingered in agony before succumbing to the same fate as his guests. His death rippled through the kingdom like a plague of silence. No justice would bring him back, and no conviction of ruse or anyone would settle the sickness now rising in people's hearts. Because if this could happen in the bishop's own home, who was safe? Who could trust their own cook, their own meal, their own mourning? England was changing, and not in the way the court poets described. It wasn't just divorce and religion and crown-swapping heads. It was deeper. Rot underneath stone, secrets behind every wall. Every act of kindness a threat. Every routine now a ritual of risk. Kitchens became crime scenes. Faith turned to suspicion. People stared a little longer at the hands that prepared their food. History didn't record what became of Roos in the end, at least not clearly. Some say he was executed. Others whisper he disappeared, spirited away by those who used him. But in either case, the outcome was the same. Fear had won. And that fear only grew stronger in the decades that followed. Across Europe, cases of poisoning multiplied. Some blamed on servants, others on mistresses, rivals, midwives, even priests. Italy saw the rise of secret poison rings. France whispered of perfumed gloves that could kill with a handshake. Royal courts developed taste testers and food rituals so elaborate they bordered on religious ceremony, and all of it led back to one truth. Power corrupts, yes, but fear paralyzes. It turns lovers into watchers, friends into accusers, kitchens into battlegrounds. When you strip away the royal titles, the velvet robes, the marble halls, what remains is the same primal terror that haunted the peasants who once huddled in smoky huts and whispered about witches in the woods. The terror of betrayal, of trust shattered, not by swords, but by something far more intimate. A spoonful of porridge, a smile, a stranger's powder. Roos was a name, a face, but he was also a warning, a ghost that followed every meal from that day forward. Because the moment you realize that anyone could be used, that even kindness can be weaponized, history no longer feels like the past. It feels like prophecy. They said the kitchens of England would never feel the same after the bishop's death, and they were right. The illusion of safety had cracked, and through that jagged opening crept a kind of dread more corrosive than poison. It was no longer just about what happened to John Roos or Bishop Fisher. It was about what the incident revealed, that power didn't need an army to kill. It only needed access to your dinner, and in a world already teetering on the edge of reform, rebellion, and religious war, this realization bled into every corner of English life. Suspicion became a second language, and kitchens, once places of warmth, laughter, and abundance, became the kingdom's most dangerous rooms. It wasn't long before other stories began to surface. Whispers that had once been dismissed as superstition took on new weight. In a noble household in Wiltshire, a scullery maid reportedly went blind after sampling the stew meant for her employer. The stew was discarded, the cook dismissed, but no one investigated further. In Kent, a brewer's apprentice fell ill and died after tasting a batch of ale that had a strange, bitter note. The barrel was burned, the boy buried. But beneath the surface, these incidents told a larger story. Someone, perhaps many, had realized how easy it was to silence a voice, using nothing more than a ladle and a lie. Even the royal court was not immune. In the colder months of 1531, Queen Catherine herself fell ill with a fever no physician could explain. Her meals were monitored, her chambers searched. One physician dared to suggest poisoning, only to be quietly dismissed 2 days later and never seen again. Henry VIII grew more paranoid by the hour. He refused anything not prepared under the direct supervision of his personal chef. All kitchen staff underwent interrogations, and taste testing became a ceremonial act. Dishes passed through 6 hands before reaching the royal table. And yet, the fear remained, because everyone knew it only took one hand to kill. The fear was not new. History is steeped in stories of poison, from the hemlock that killed Socrates to the arsenic-soaked beauty products of Renaissance Italy. But in Tudor England, poison took on a new face. Not exotic, not foreign, not the tool of assassins in faraway lands. It became local, familiar, domestic. The enemy wasn't the cloaked intruder. It was the servant you trusted, the cook who fed your children, the maid who stirred your tea. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was personal. And that's what made it terrifying. The church, ever eager to find meaning in catastrophe, began preaching sermons on the dangers of hidden sin. They claimed the poisoning of Fisher was divine punishment for the kingdom's growing moral rot, that God had allowed such a death to show England what happened when it turned from righteousness. But others, those who looked past pulpits and prayers, saw something more worldly. They saw opportunity. Poison became the weapon of the discreet, the clever, the weak who wished to wound the strong. And so the rumors spread. In London, a wealthy widow named Eleanor Greswold was arrested after her 4th husband died under what they called suspicious culinary circumstances. The bodies of her previous husbands were exhumed. All bore signs of long-term exposure to deadly herbs. She confessed, though only after 12 hours in the Tower. Her case was unusual, not because of the crime, but because she was caught. Most weren't. Most poisonings, historians now believe, were never documented, never investigated. They were dismissed as illness, bad luck, or the wrath of God. And in the age before autopsies, poison was a ghost, silent, invisible, and nearly impossible to trace. But as more high-profile deaths mounted, the Crown could no longer ignore the trend. Secret poisonings were becoming an epidemic, and with every new victim, the boundaries of trust shrank. A nobleman in York allegedly refused to eat for 3 days after firing his cook for sneezing near a pie. His paranoia turned into full-blown madness. He eventually died of starvation. Ironically, the only noble death that year not blamed on poison. Across the Channel, the courts of France and Italy began to take note. England, they whispered, had become a land of silent daggers and smiling assassins, a place where meals ended lives, not just appetites. In response, King Henry commissioned what would become one of the most secretive operations of his reign, a covert culinary intelligence network. Known only to a handful of advisors, this group was tasked with monitoring all food handlers in royal households, vetting staff, tracking ingredients, and when necessary, extracting confessions through means the public would never hear about. Kitchens were no longer places of nourishment. They were surveillance zones. Every servant was a suspect, every dish a potential weapon. And yet, despite all this, the deaths continued. A noble child died after eating a sweet tart gifted by a family friend. A bishop collapsed during communion, the wine tasting slightly bitter. A soldier in Dover began vomiting uncontrollably after chewing on salted pork. Investigators found nothing. No fingerprints, no trails, only symptoms. And fear, always fear, because even the best precautions couldn't erase the truth that poison was no longer a crime of passion. It was a tool of politics. Life, swords, or guns, it left no battlefield. Only silence. But the most disturbing case was still to come. In 1533, nearly 2 years after Bishop Fisher's death, a scandal erupted in the court of Anne Boleyn. One of her closest ladies-in-waiting fell mysteriously ill, her hair falling out in clumps, her skin yellowing like parchment. Physicians blamed an imbalance of humors, but those closest to her knew better. She had recently fallen out of favor. She had been overheard speaking kindly of Queen Catherine. She had enemies. And then came the discovery that sent ripples through the court. A jar, tucked beneath her mattress, filled with a white powder. The jar bore no label. No one admitted placing it there. Anne ordered it destroyed. No charges were filed, but word spread quickly. Poison had once again breached the sanctity of the palace. This time, however, it was different. Because the suspect was not a cook or a servant. It was another noblewoman, one who weeks later would vanish without a trace. No arrest, no trial, just silence. The kind of silence that wraps itself around power like a shroud. And so the whispers returned. If noblewomen were now deploying poison against one another, what hope did the rest of the kingdom have? Trust, once broken, cannot be stitched back together. And in Tudor England it was no longer simply about who sat on the throne. It was about who held the ladle, who poured the wine, who smiled too widely before handing you your supper. That was the new war, quiet, intimate, and utterly inescapable. They thought the danger would fade, that time would smother the fear like a cold fog over a battlefield. But it never did. The poisonings didn't stop. They simply changed shape. What began in kitchens and chalices seeped outward into every thread of daily life, into the medicines you swallowed, the perfumes you wore, the ink you signed your life away with. The paranoia birthed by the bishop's death and the queen's fevers didn't wither. It metastasized. And as England marched into the heart of the 16th century, the country no longer feared only swords and sermons. It feared the invisible hand, the poisoner, the ghost at the feast. By 1540, a new kind of panic had settled over the court. Not the overt hysteria of mobs and pyres, but a quieter, deadlier sort of dread, one that coiled itself around routine. Physicians began refusing to prescribe herbal remedies unless they mixed them personally. Apothecaries were often suspected of lacing tinctures with foxglove or belladonna, claiming ignorance when death came too swiftly. The difference between cure and kill was now paper-thin. Even the crown's own doctors were not beyond suspicion, and in this climate of doubt, poison found its most fertile ground yet: medicine. It was subtle, seductive even. After all, the same ingredients used in ancient poisons were often hailed as miracle cures. Mercury, arsenic, lead, all were regularly used in treatments for syphilis, melancholy, or plague. Patients would willingly drink what could easily kill them, trusting that their doctor knew the difference between dose and death. But in many cases, the line blurred. Sometimes deliberately, a nobleman sick with fever might wake up dead, not because his illness won, but because someone close to him wanted his estate, and with doctors given total control over the body, the crime was nearly untraceable. It was murder disguised as medicine, and it flourished. One especially notorious case, largely erased from public record, unfolded in the household of Sir Malcolm Briars, a wealthy landowner with ties to the court. His third wife, Eleanor, had long suspected his physician of overprescribing mercury-based treatments for what appeared to be minor ailments. Briars, a man known for his vigor and brutality, began to deteriorate rapidly, his skin flaking, his vision dimming, his thoughts slipping into madness. Days before his death, he was said to have ranted about voices, shadows, and a smell in his room that no one else could detect. When he died, his physician vanished. No arrest, no explanation, only a purse full of gold left behind and a note. Medicine is faith. But what's most disturbing is what came next. Eleanor remarried just 4 months later to that very same physician, who returned under a new name, having grown a beard and donned a French accent. He wasn't executed. He wasn't even hunted. Why? Because people in power often protect those who understand how to kill without leaving a mark. That was the new class of assassin. Not a dagger-wielding rogue in the shadows, but a man of science, education, and perfect handwriting. And in a world where truth could be shaped like clay, these men thrived. But it wasn't just noble houses that suffered. The fear trickled down into villages, parishes, schools. In Yorkshire, an entire family perished after eating meat bought from a traveling butcher. The man was never found. In Devon, a priest collapsed mid-sermon, choking on blood moments after sipping wine brought by a local parishioner. The bottle had no trace of toxins, at least none the local coroner could identify, and in Canterbury 3 sisters were found dead in their beds, their mouths stained with a dark liquid. They had been gifted sleeping draughts by a neighbor who claimed they had trouble resting. The neighbor was tried and burned, but whether she was guilty or simply feared for her knowledge of herbs, no one could say. That's what poison did to England. It turned wisdom into danger, intelligence into suspicion. The wise woman, the herbalist, the midwife, figures once revered, were now accused of hiding deadly secrets in their pouches and prayers. And the more the church pushed back against ancient knowledge, the more it feared the very things it once blessed. Plants, hands, healing. The Reformation didn't just divide churches, it divided belief itself, and into that chasm fell countless innocent lives, erased by accusation, fire, or the slow, shivering death of poison. By the late 1540, as the crown attempted to codify its fears, new laws were passed. Anyone found guilty of poisoning, whether servant, noble, or spouse, would be tried not for murder, but for treason, because the act was no longer seen as a personal vendetta, but as an attack on the very stability of England. Poison was rebellion, a war against the natural order, and so it was punished with a spectacle meant to terrify, boiling alive. In 1542, a woman named Margaret Davy became the first known person to suffer this fate. A servant in a London household, she was accused of lacing a pot of broth with arsenic. Her employer and his daughter died. The trial was swift, the evidence circumstantial, but fear outweighed doubt. She was stripped, chained, and lowered into a cauldron of boiling liquid in Smithfield Market. Her screams echoing through the streets, her flesh sloughing off in sheets. Hundreds watched. Some cheered, others turned away, but the message was clear. Poison would be answered with fire and agony. Did it stop the killings? No. It made them smarter, more refined. It pushed poisoners deeper underground, forced them to study alchemy, to forge new compounds, to learn from apothecaries in secret. And so, the war became quieter, but no less lethal. Over time, poisoning stopped being a peasant's crime. It became an art, a tool of the elite, and its victims no longer gasped or writhed. They simply faded, their deaths recorded as consumption or fever or God's will. This is where the darkest truth hides. Because poison, unlike war or fire, doesn't just kill the body, it corrodes trust. It rewrites the way people live, love, and feed one another. In Tudor England, a poisoned cup wasn't just a crime, it was a philosophy, a warning that the things which nourish us can also be our undoing, that the hand which serves us might also be the one that destroys us. And that history, real, brutal, living history, is not written only in battles and kings, but in kitchens, kisses, and the quiet betrayal of a powder no one ever saw. We like to think that we've left those days behind, that we've grown past such primitive fears. But the truth is, we've only changed the tools. We've traded belladonna for misinformation, arsenic for ideology, and herbs for hashtags. But the fear is the same, the poison is the same, and so is the lie we keep telling ourselves. That we would see it coming,